Hi there, guys. Thank you for taking the time to dial into this. We appreciate it. Supposed to start off with just a little bit about myself. So I'm Justin Campbell. I have recently moved over to TrendMicro through the acquisition of Cloud Conformity. I was one of the early employees of Cloud Conformity here in Europe, essentially helping businesses get visibility of their AWS infrastructure, largely in relation to security risks and compliance issues. And it was a fantastic journey with Cloud Conformity, helping businesses be more compliant in the cloud. My role now is to lead the conformity, the Cloud One conformity overlay sales team for Europe. So that means I'm still focusing just on conformity and helping my colleagues at Trend talk about conformity with prospects that they think have a need for it. I suppose for a little bit of context, the way Cloud Conformity was started is our founders, it was kind of a business born out of its own necessity. Our founders were working for a large government agency in Australia, helping them with their migration from a data center into AWS. And they successfully did that migration, which was led by our founders. And then when they were building the foundations around security and compliance, they felt that the individuals at this government agency whose skill set was largely from a legacy environment, that the cloud was new to them, were going to struggle to get the level of visibility and compliance that they required using cloud native tooling. So they went to the marketplace to look for a solution. They felt that the solutions that were around at the time didn't address it in the way that they would have addressed it. So they spotted that they felt that it was a business opportunity, and they built Cloud Conformity off the back of that. Just the agenda for today. I'm going to spend I'm not going to spend too long going through things before doing a live demo or a demo of conformity. I'm going to do the demo, at least try my best to do the demo in the context of common challenges that a lot of businesses are facing in the cloud when it comes to security and compliance. And then my colleague Paul, who's our technical cloud solutions architect, is going to do a live demonstration of auto remediation and template scanning. So what he's going to do there is he is going to make an S3 bucket publicly available, and you're going to witness, hopefully, our auto remediation close that S3 bucket down in real time. And then template scanning is our CloudFormation template scanner. So it's essentially embedding our scanner into the CI/CD pipeline to audit infrastructure as code pre-build. So a developer could be working on a CloudFormation template. They can scan that template, they get visibility of the successes, but also the threats within that template. The key thing is that how our customers use that is if they try to put that CloudFormation template into the repository, it would just get, with threats in it, it would just get rejected. Our ultimate goal is to try eradicate new threats entering the environment through developer misconfigurations or just foundational flaws in the template of infrastructure as code. And then after that, we're going to open up the floor to questions. So common cloud challenges. I will talk through these at a high level, and I'm not going to talk through all the challenges we hear. These are ones we hear frequently. So if you start at the top left with the gentleman with the cloud over his face and move around in a clockwise direction, I think the first challenge that we hear a lot of is businesses struggling to just get visibility of their environment, just visibility of where all their accounts reside within their environment and where all the threats within those accounts reside. I think the status quo, if you like, in Europe especially, is businesses using cloud native security services, and a lot of them are struggling. I think they're finding the use cases to be quite fragmented. What I would stress is that we have not built Cloud Conformity to compete with or eradicate cloud native services at all. We have very strong integrations with them and customers that use them cohesively with cloud conformity. I'm just merely stressing a challenge that we hear a lot of that's linked to that. The next one is building guardrails. Businesses are realizing that building guardrails is a very hard, very time-consuming thing to do. What do I mean by a guardrail? Taking an AWS service, tying it to a compliance standard that's important to the business, or the 5 pillars of the well-architected framework, and turning out a deep enough number of rules or checks or guardrails. You know, risk in the cloud is one of those things where good security hygiene is good, but to some degree, what you don't know until a guardrail has been defined, so that you can define whether a line has been crossed that will cause a security or compliance risk. I think part of that challenge is keeping up pace with AWS. AWS release new services at such a frequent pace that we, as a business that have a team that does this full time and all we focus on is AWS, struggle to keep up pace. So that's a challenge for businesses. The next challenge is businesses realizing that relying on a smaller InfoSec team for the most part to manage security in the cloud is just not scalable. So they're looking for a way to introduce best practices to new teams or team members so that they can get to their outcome in a different fashion, all with a view to complying with best practice and get a common line of visibility of what other teams are doing as well. So if I think about conformity, the different users of conformity span DevOps/engineering, cloud ops/infrastructure, and InfoSec, and they largely do use our tool in a different fashion in the way that works for them. And also for teams and team members that are not very highly skilled within AWS. It addresses that skills gap by giving new team members an easier way, should I say. The next challenge is businesses are feeling the pain whereby they've built this foundation for security and compliance when their infrastructure is of a certain size. And then what's happening is their infrastructure is just growing rapidly in a short space of time. So that's largely through a migration into AWS or also through just rapid development. And they're starting to experience bottlenecks. They almost outgrow that foundation and they experience bottlenecks. What they're looking for is a way to build a foundation for security and compliance in the AWS environment that works for what their infrastructure size and design looks like today, but is also scalable so that as it grows or the design elements change or the team structure to support that growth changes, they don't experience those bottlenecks. The other one is businesses who are realizing that there's no getting away from giving developers autonomy to do their thing. You realize that if they want to be as agile as they need to be and innovate as fast as they are under pressure to do so in AWS, they have to give their developers autonomy. But questions are being asked in terms of, well, what does this mean in terms of new threats that are entering the environment through developer misconfigurations, right? And that's not just, a lot of emphasis gets placed on the speed at which developers work at. And for me, not enough emphasis gets placed on the fact that infrastructure as code templates, largely Terraform and CloudFormation, are often have security and compliance risks baked into its foundation. So what I mean is, regardless of how quickly or slowly a developer was putting that repository putting that template into the repository, if there's a misconfigured S3 bucket in that template, he or she is going to introduce it into the environment. And then the last is, I think this is more a goal in that when businesses have come to the point that there's no getting away from security, and at some stage in that software development lifecycle, if they're able to embed security into everything that they do throughout that software development lifecycle, all the way from the beginning, then it not only makes them more resilient, but it actually enables them to build software better and faster. Because the old way of doing things, the more waterfall way of doing things, was siloed, whereby developer would build something before he could go live. A security team or a compliance team would need to validate what is built, and they would usually go back to that developer and say, no, XYZ is not compliant, you need to fix it. And it actually entails doing a lot more to fix those problems that the security team or the compliance team have identified. So I'll pause there. I hope that adds some color and context to the demo that I go through. Some users of cloud conformity. So users of cloud conformity span well, cloud architects and cloud operations, cloud center of excellence. I'd put them into more of the category of maybe the buyer, the user of cloud conformity, if I'm honest. But I would put cloud ops and cloud infrastructure into that bracket. Engineering and DevOps there's more users of cloud conformity by a distance who are engineers and DevOps engineers than anyone else, and then also InfoSec. And like I was saying before, they really do use the tool in a different fashion. They all do it so that they can have the best security hygiene and they get visibility of what other teams are doing. But InfoSec don't use cloud conformity in the same way as DevOps do. Some European customers of cloud conformity, these are just a few of them. Novartis, Ticketmaster, I'm sure you guys are familiar with. I'm sure you can notice here companies like FanDuel, Tide, Cobalt. These are born in the cloud, born on AWS types of businesses. Kering is a large luxury goods brand out of Paris. Only thing I would say here, and this spans beyond our European customers to customers abroad like Atlassian and Qantas and Air New Zealand. The companies I think that view cloud conformity as the strongest tool for them are companies that are born in the cloud, first and foremost. They don't know anything else. Companies that are all in or largely all in on AWS. I think we're viewed as the strongest product for AWS because our focus has always been AWS as opposed to multi-cloud. So we've been able to commit all of our resource to one cloud provider as opposed to three main cloud providers. And then also companies that are at the start of their AWS journey and often in regulated industries where they're under pressure to get that foundation for security right from the start. And they're just easier companies to work with because their infrastructure is quite straightforward. So that's it, guys. What I'll do now is I will move over to the live demonstration. So if you just bear with me a second. And I'll do can you guys not see my screen? No. Stop sharing. Could you see my screen before?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you just need the right screen.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, now we can see.
So this is the dashboard to Cloud Conformity's SaaS portal that I'm going to take you guys through today. The way that I'm going to do it is I'm going to very briefly take you through each aspect of this dashboard. And the reason why I'm going to do it briefly is because we're going to dive into each of these in more detail over the course of the demo. A couple of things I should point out are that everything that you see here is API driven. So any of this data can be pulled via an API into your own environment, your own user interface. Any configurations can be done via an API as well. The data that we as in TrendMicro have access to is the read-only metadata at the infrastructure level. So if a user made an S3 bucket publicly readable, we would see that as the user that did it and the event that took place, but we would never under any circumstances know what resided within that S3 bucket. Technology is SaaS, it's serverless, and all the data is encrypted at rest. So we don't have visibility to any of the data. Every one of our guardrails, and I'm going to talk about our guardrails in some depth because I think it's an important component of the tool, is built against at least one of the 5 pillars of the Well Architected framework and at least one of a whole bunch of compliance standards. And I think there's largely 3 pillars to this tool, if you like, which are detective, corrective, and preventative. So detective in the form of this conformity bot which runs by default once per hour on each account, and it shows the number of checks that took place, the number that succeeded, the number that failed, the severity level of the failures, and your overall compliance score. Real-time threat monitoring, which is monitoring events in real time, sub a few seconds. I'm going to talk about how this works and the importance of it, but it's still detective. You're detecting a threat, albeit within a few seconds. Corrective is in the form of our actionable remediation pages, which are designed to give users the context and steps for every alert to know what they need to do to take action, as well as our auto remediation, which is what Paul's going to do a live demo on, which is using a Lambda function to remediate issues without any human interaction. Preventative is in the form of our CloudFormation template scanner, which Paul's going to do a demo of as well. And that's essentially embedding our scanner into the CI/CD pipeline to audit infrastructure as code pre-built. So if you're a developer, you could scan your CloudFormation template. It gets scanned across our 600 odd rules across 70 different AWS services, scan against the Well Architected framework and compliance standards, and return a result of what that template looks like pre-built. If there's failures and the developer tries to put it into the repository, it will fail. This is just a compliance level evolution over time against each of the pillars. This is your status per AWS region. And these are your most critical failures, which I'll come to. On the left-hand side, you've got a repository of all of your accounts. So you've got all of your accounts. You can group accounts together. You've got your individual AWS accounts as well. To add a single account, you can add it here. You can add a group of accounts here. And you can also add accounts using an API. The first thing that I'm going to talk about, though, is the guardrails, because I think the guardrails are crucial in that whether you are building something yourself using cloud native security services or using something like this, a lot of the time the functionality is largely meaningless without the guardrails that form the backbone of that. So we've, over time, built up about 580 rules across 70 different AWS services. 534 of them are out of the box, meaning you switch on Cloud Conformity, you have access to them immediately. I will go on to show you how you can disable and configure rules that are not relevant. 50 of them are rules that you would need to configure yourself because we just don't have access to that information, like an IAM manager role or a blacklisted region. And like I say, each of these rules have been built against the 5 pillars of the Well Architected framework and a bunch of compliance standards. The way we've built these rules is twofold, and I'd say largely the first is we've got a team internally where all they do is take AWS services tied to the Well Architected framework, tied to compliance standards, to just turn out a deep number of rules, which are essentially different use cases, right? Essentially what businesses are battling to do using config, not that they're having a problem using config, just having a problem actually thinking about these guardrails and the time that it takes and then keeping up pace with AWS. The second part of the challenge is, I got lost there. The second way in which we build out our rules repository is we allow customers to build custom rules. So if there's a rule that you require that we don't offer out of the box, you can build that rule using config rules or an API. Soon you'll actually be able to do it within this console, which is not going to be dependent on config, and it's going to just streamline the process of building out a custom rule. It's going to make it far easier to do. Something to stress is that we have rules for and very strong integrations with every AWS native security service, right? So config, guard duty, inspector, Macy, health, trusted advisor. I think I've mentioned them all. The point being is that what that means is that any work that you had done on a native service in the past wouldn't be forgone. And if there was a use case where it made sense to use a native service, you could ingest those results in the usability and the integrations of Cloud Conformity, essentially enhancing the user experience of the cloud native tool that you use. We've got customers that we consider to be very cloud native that do this. They use Cloud Conformity alongside other cloud native tools and they use it cohesively. We We absolutely have not designed cloud conformity to try to compete with cloud native services, which I think is an important thing. And I think the nice thing for you guys being an AWS user group is I truly believe that 580 rules across 70 different AWS services is significantly ahead of tools that have had a multi-cloud focus in terms of depth and breadth, just purely because our focus has been on AWS. Had we have decided to go to market as a multi-cloud provider, we would have shared the same amount of resource across 3 major cloud providers. So since inception, we have been only focused on AWS, and it's only now that we are going live on Azure, and later on we'll go live in GCP. And we've almost been forced because of the types of customers we have becoming multi-cloud themselves. But we're still very clear that we are AWS first and foremost. Our tool will work in the same way from a functionality standpoint on those cloud providers, but it will be very watered down in terms of rules and services that we cover. We will still strive to be the leaders in AWS, so that's still where the majority of our resource will go. The next thing that I'll talk about, in fact, before doing that, I'll rather just go over here to our knowledge base, because I want to show you what these rules or these guardrails look like in the form of a repository, right? And I think the thing to note here is that it's the depth and breadth that you're getting. We've assessed that risk in the cloud is largely a case of what you don't know until you've defined a guardrail to know whether a line has been crossed. And really, you have 2 choices as a business. You can either build these yourselves, or you can use a solution that gives you a decent number of them out of the box. The challenge with building them is what we've discussed. They're hard to build. Compliance standards are not built with the cloud in mind, and keeping up pace with AWS is a challenge in itself. What we see from customers that were building rules themselves is that they usually build the most common use case for an AWS service. Maybe have 2 or 3 rules. Like for S3, they'll have an S3 bucket shouldn't be made publicly available to the world. But it's the depth that you're getting here, right? So I'll take I've got RDS in there. I'll take a fairly common AWS service, RDS, and if you look at RDS down here on the right-hand side, you look at the depth, it's quite significant. There's quite a significant number of rules. Now, there might be a rule here that you don't require, in which case you could disable it or configure it. And there might be a rule that you need that you don't see here, in which case you can build it. But what we almost always see is businesses that identify several rules that they didn't think of themselves that are relevant to them. And therefore, what that means is that those were risks that they otherwise had no idea existed, essentially. So I wanted to go a little bit deeper there, because you could really, in many ways, think about cloud conformity first and foremost as a guardrails tool. And when I think about our customers that are cloud native enough, that type of company who are a rare breed, in my opinion, who have the ability to get to a very similar outcome to what I'm going to show you, stitching together all the AWS native security services, they still have a challenge building guardrails, because that's a different challenge. That's actually having the ability to think about what those guardrails would look like. What I'll talk about now is the remediation piece, because I think that ties into the guardrails from an actionability standpoint. So I'll come over here to a bunch of rules. I'll choose S3 bucket default encryption, and I'll show you a bunch of things that you can do with it. But if I click resolve, firstly, you can see that it's taken you to remediation page. So for every one of those guardrails that I showed you on this page over here, you have an equivalent page like this, which gives you a high-level overview of what the rule is, the pillar of the well-architected framework it relates to, the risk level and why we consider it to be a high risk. That can be changed and controlled by you also. The compliance standards that are affected by this particular guardrail. What could happen if you don't take action on this particular alert? And then crucially, the steps for a user to follow, either in the AWS console on the left or the command lines and an API on the right. The challenge that businesses are having is that, and I would say largely using cloud native tooling here, is that they're being alerted of events, but they're not being provided with the context nor the steps to know what to actually do. And ultimately, it's resulting in remediation times that are more drawn out than they need to be. A lot of pressure being placed on individuals being made responsible for it, and it being hard to introduce best practice to new teams or team members, especially team members that are not very highly skilled within AWS. So this really does go a long way in addressing that, in conjunction with auto remediation, which I'll show you as well. The feedback that we get is that this has really enabled businesses to have their most advanced AWS engineers focusing on innovation in AWS, or the most in-depth technical problems, because a lot of these are now seen as low-hanging fruit because they can be done by less advanced employees or even by a Lambda function. In terms of the alerting of that, so the alerts can go out to different users in the console, different users having different access rights. Some might have read-only, some might have the ability to configure or disable rules. But I think what's more interesting is to talk about it in the integration. And that's because we've integrated Conformity into commonly used ticketing, notification, workflow types of channels. Anything you don't see here, our customers use SNS. So lots using seams like Splunk or Logarithm, Alien Vault, even tools like Datadog, Microsoft Teams, things like that. The challenge that we're addressing here is twofold. It's firstly businesses wanting their users to be able to receive the alerts that are relevant to them from Conformity in the channel they're comfortable receiving them in, with a link to the remediation page, as opposed to having to actually even log into the tool. The second part of the challenge is being able to configure the triggers in these channels so that every alert that goes out to the team or team member that's responsible for remediating it. A big challenge as well that we hear a lot of is alert fatigue, false positives alerts that are not relevant to the environment as a whole, which I'll show you when it comes to configuring the actual rule, and alerts that are not relevant to the individual that receives it, which in my mind is a false positive as well, because if a user receives hundreds of alerts a day and only 5% of those are relevant to that user, then there's a higher chance he's going to miss the 5% that are relevant to him. So the way you manage that here, and this is also for eradicating noise, right? So you might set up a Slack channel and you can create, these are all different triggers that I'm scrolling by, and you can create an infinite number of those. So I suppose first to talk to eradicating noise, if you set up a Slack channel with every field here ticked, so you can filter according to AWS service, you can filter according to region, specific rule, tagging for exception purposes, specific pillars and severity levels. If you left this as blank, a decent sized infrastructure could receive thousands of alerts a day. But if you just reduce that to security related events that were very high or extreme, we've seen environments go from thousands of alerts a day to less than 100, which becomes more manageable. So that's how you reduce noise. But how you can filter it so every alert goes to the right team or team member is by using these triggers. So you could say, for instance, well, I only want an S3 related, a security related S3 event that's of a severity level high or above to go to this particular team member. And you can use tagging to make it as specific as you want. When I go through the filtering of checks and compliance standards, there's a bunch more filters which are actually going to be carried over into there. At the moment, you would use tagging to manage that, but I'll cover that. The continuation to that in terms of the challenge that it's solving is the configuring of actual rules. So if I come back to the rules here, the key thing here is that we're giving you access to 530 odd rules out of the box, right? Now, there are going to be rules that are not relevant to your environment or an account within your environment, and there's a reason why. So we allow you to manage that depending on your user's access rights. So you can do that by either disabling the rule entirely or configuring it. So if, for instance, this was on an account that only hosted your public website and therefore S3 buckets were supposed to be publicly available, you could just go ahead and disable it. It's not a relevant rule in that case. If it was on an account that hosted the public website amongst more sensitive buckets, you could use tagging for exception purposes to manage that. You can change the severity level as well. And the only thing we ask is mandatory is you have to leave a note. If you try to save it without leaving a note, it doesn't allow you to. And that's because you need there to be a trace internally of a change like this that had taken place. You can't have a developer logging in, disabling a rule, and there being no trace of that. Something that's very important, a feature that's very important that we've baked into this is called profiles. This is particularly important for AWS infrastructures of scale, companies that are growing and adding new accounts at a frequent pace. Because you can think about profiles as a representation of how you want a particular account or environment to be set up. So it could be profile staging, profile prod, profile non-prod, profile test. And that means the rules you want enabled, the rules you want disabled, the rules you want configured in a certain way, configured to a certain severity level. So that when you are uploading new accounts, you essentially just assign a profile to it. You don't have to go through the manual process of configuring each account over and over again. Some of our customers that have in excess of 100, well, between 100 and say 400 accounts, I think most often they don't have more than about 6 profiles at the most. We sometimes even see customers that have 100 accounts and 3 profiles. You know, they can configure 3 profiles in an evaluation of the tool. And if they went live, it's far easier for them to roll it out across all 100 accounts than if they had to do it over and over again. So if you leave a note, you can obviously save it. The thing that I'll talk about next is our real-time threat monitoring. So real-time threat monitoring is monitoring events in real time by user and event. Sub a few seconds, you can see me here as it was just as the user in the event. I just showed you that you had to leave a note in order to configure, in order to save a rule. Just checking you guys can see my screen. Yeah. How this works is it's a combination of CloudWatch event rules and CloudTrail logs that are running through our rules engine in real time. So to the S3 example, if a user made an S3 bucket publicly readable, we would see that as the user that did it and the event that took place in real time. It would get run against all of our S3 rules in real time, and then it would fire off the successes and the failures in real time. So the value in this is that you can be alerted of certain events that you care about that are of a critical nature in real time as opposed to once per hour. Once per hour is quite frequent. I think it's pretty frequent actually. But there's certain events where you feel like quite a lot can happen in 59.8 seconds. The user logging into AWS without MFA, or a user logging into AWS from a blacklisted region, and it's a region where no employee should ever be. These are the types of things that our customers get peace of mind from real-time threat monitoring. Wasn't built with this in mind, but our users that are DevOps and engineering, they like this because it shortens the feedback loop for them. And those are largely developers that have been given the autonomy and accountability to secure their own code, DevSecOps cultures to a large degree. The continuation to that is auto remediation, and I'll talk about this at a high level because Paul will demo it. But essentially, it's using a Lambda function to remediate issues without any human interaction, right? The important thing here is that we as a Trend are not remediating anything on your behalf. We still only access the metadata. If you look at this diagram, we're responsible for the white part of this diagram. Your infrastructure is responsible for the gray. So user makes an S3 bucket publicly readable. We pick it up in real time. We publish a message to the SNS topic, and then it's out of our hands. It's your infrastructure that takes care of the rest. You have full control over how you would want to use this. So which account you would want to use it for and which rules you would want to use it for. So there's no out-of-the-box rules here. The number of out-of-the-box rules here are 0. You would start with 1. And most of our customers start with 1, 2, or 3. And usually most of them don't go beyond 10. we've got very few customers that use this at scale. They're very cautious of how they use this. And the two use cases are obviously automation and extra depth and security. So automation is obvious, but examples of extra depth and security would be things like CloudTrail would be one. CloudTrail should never be deactivated. There's no use case that I'm aware of where CloudTrail should ever be deactivated. Or on certain accounts, there's no use case where an S3 bucket should be made publicly available. So is it good that we can alert you of these events in real time? Yes. Are you more resilient as a business if you know that within just a few seconds, that S3 bucket will be closed or CloudTrail will be reactivated? You'll be alerted of that event that took place and that was fixed by auto remediation, but you're not relying on a human, even if it is in real time that they're being alerted, to go and actually take action. I think auto remediation goes a long way in giving you that extra depth in security. The last thing that I'll talk about before handing over to Paul, and then we'll take questions after that, is the filtering for checks and the reporting and how that ties into the well-architected reviews as well. So if I come over here to the staging account, I've been speaking about conformity in the sense of users don't have to log into the tool because of the integrations, which is true, but there are absolutely use cases where our users do want to log into the tool. It depends on how they use conformity. And when they do, if we're firing off so much data, we need you to be able to slice and dice that data to make it digestible, right? So we let you do that in a number of ways. If you make a mental note of the 7,500 odd checks when this bot ran on the staging account, you can filter that according to AWS service, resource type, region, specific rule, specific tag, resource ID, specific pillar, specific compliance standard, severity level, and so on. So that's what I was saying earlier. These filters are going to be moved over to the communication triggers as well, but that's managed with tagging today. And you can just slice and dice it as finely as you want. If I remove success, firstly, you can see that that number's been filtered down to 2,800 odd, but that's still too much, right? That's too much for anyone to go through on a console. Yes, we start off with rules that have the highest failure count and highest severity level, and you can work your way down, but that's still too much. So you can really deal with it in whatever fashion you want. You can say, okay, well, let's look only for security related events that are related to GDPR that are of a severity level higher above. And that's been filtered down to 118 checks. Now that's more manageable, right? You can click on each of those to get context into each of the failures when they were introduced, the tags associated to them and so on. You can click the remediation page to take you straight to the page to show you how to fix it. And you can generate a report. So you can have a report, this could be called security, GDPR, and you can generate a CSV or a PDF report. And this gives you an easy way to accurately pull data showing what your posture looks like on your environment or a particular account against a specific compliance standard. You can also see what it looked like 6 months ago, 3 months ago, and today, and hopefully show that positive trajectory. But what I want to show you is where are we going and where this ties into the well-architected framework and well-architected reviews, excuse me. And we're not moving from a reporting standpoint, and we're not moving away from what I just showed you, but it's just as supplementary. And I think this is designed for less technical individuals that want to understand, well, what do these reports actually mean? And what do these results actually mean in the context of the review processes for these different compliance standards? So we consider the well-architected framework as a compliance standard. I think by definition, it's probably slightly different to a typical compliance standard, but naturally, given the audience, you guys are all familiar, and the topic of today, you're all familiar with well-architected reviews. CIS have their own version, NIST, SOC have one, and there's others that we're rolling out that have their own version of this. So this is essentially baking the results that I showed you on the previous page, and you can filter the checks in the exact same way as I showed you before for the well-architected reviews. There's certain checks we can't look for, like how do you determine what your priorities are? But there's checks that we can. So how do you mitigate deployment risks? You can see the failures and the successes and the rules from the rules that are failures and successes against this particular question. You can click on the source of truth if you like, which in this case is AWS, and you can get that context from AWS. And we do have customers largely in Australia that are AWS consulting partners that use this tool to help them with well-architected reviews. You can't automate the whole well-architected review using this because there's questions that we can't track. But they do find that what this does is it definitely leads to more data-driven statement of work discussions as opposed to discovery-led conversations where a big challenge they face is they get different answers from different people. This is much more a case of, here is the data, this is where you're having failures, this is how those failures were introduced, this is what you need to do. And they find that it's enabling them to do more reviews because they can do them faster, and it's enabling them to find certain findings that they otherwise wouldn't have found doing it manually. And it gives a customer the ability to kind of have continuous visibility of how they're complying against the well-architected review, as opposed to just doing it at different points in time and then trying to remember best practices off the back of it. The whole tool has been designed against the well-architected framework, right? Before we had this feature, and this is something we've had for about 8 months now, and it's been hugely popular, not just by our consulting partner customers, but by end users, is consulting partners would do scans of their customers' metadata environments so that they could go, when they're advising their customers on best practice, they're doing it again off data as opposed to discovery types of discussions. NIST and every other will have their own version of this. So it's structured differently. It's not questions, it's segments. But again, you can see the failures and successes. If open information flow enforcement, you can see the rules where you're having failures. You click on that and get context into every one of those 46 failures. The source of truth here would be the NIST page of their framework. I'm sure they've got hundreds of pages, and this takes you directly to the page that gives you the context that you need about why this is a particular vulnerability. So I'll pause there, guys, and I hope that was helpful. And before taking questions, I'll pass over to Paul, who's going to do a live demo of auto remediation, where he's going to, in his own AWS account, make an S3 bucket publicly readable, and you'll be able to see auto remediation, pick that up and close it down, and also scan a CloudFormation template. And hopefully he'll be able to provide some context from the developer or from the user's experience whilst he's doing that. So thank you.
Thank you, Justin. I'm just going to ask you to stop sharing.
Yeah.
Share my screen. I'll start with the auto remediation example. So like it was mentioned in that GitHub repository, the classic example is a developer signing into AWS, creating an S3 bucket. Let's give it a name. That means I'm going to delete it afterwards. We'll just make this one as default, but then I will unblock the access as soon as it's created. Here, edit this bucket's properties, permissions actually, so to enable it to have public access, and then from the ACL, give read access to anyone. Now it's an empty bucket, so this is not terribly serious. But if this were a bucket that had a lot of customer data, you can understand the sort of risks that will be associated with that. So the first step is that we're actually going to see all these actions that I just took in the real-time monitoring. So we saw a minute ago, I'm logged in as root. Yeah, bad practice, don't do this. And you can see the different actions that I took, sort of creating the bucket and updating the bucket and updating the bucket's ACL. So here I'm going to go to my pre-configured reports. That's about S3 buckets. View, edit, And I can see that, oh, wow, I have a new very high risk failure about S3 bucket public read access. Open this up. A minute ago, introduced by AWS system, that's my root ID. I can click the link here that will actually bring me to the bucket itself. In this case, I don't need to follow the steps because I have the SNS integration connected to the auto remediation application. So all I need to do is click send via SMS. And then if all works well, within a few seconds, we should see some actions being taken by the auto remediation as of here. So we'll give it a few seconds while the internet does its thing. There we go. So we can see that a bit less than a minute ago, the bad bucket 1234's ACL has been updated. And to prove it to you, I'm going to refresh the page here. And there we go. The ACL has been updated. There's no longer public access granted to everyone. So yeah, you can follow up on, you can have this be logged to a scene. You can review this in the thread monitoring dashboard, have reports generated off the back of this. There's lots of things that you can do around this very basic functionality. Now on to the second example, where instead of trying to correct things after they've been deployed, we're actually trying to catch misconfigurations before they're deployed, the template scanning. And essentially what I'm going to try to scan here. Now this is, of course, this is the UI version of the template scan, right? So the ideal scenario is to have this connected to a CI/CD pipeline, where every time you're trying to commit CloudFormation template, it gets scanned by this template scanner, sort of like a linter would your code. And if ever there's some errors that are too severe, it would block this CloudFormation template from being accepted. It's better for you as a developer because you're just going to be committing better code instead of code that's filled with issues. So this one here is full of errors, as you'll see. Yeah, so from this template, which I have right here, essentially there's a few different errors that I created. There's a lot of successes that are done too. So it's very similar actually to the rest of the UI, where you have the failures associated to the template. Now, in this case, I'm going to fix this error here. So instance called my instance is not using the latest generation of instances. This is the last generation. If I want to know more about this, I click resolve. It brings me to the knowledge base. I can see, wow, okay. This is the previous generation of instance types. Yeah, M1 small. Go to the remediation steps. Okay, so M1 small, what's the equivalent today? Oh, it's T2 small. So I go to my CloudFormation template. Now I've already fixed it in the fixed template here. So change the instance type to T2. Go back in Cloud Conformity, re-upload my template. Yeah, that's the fixed one. Upload it. And yeah, what used to be the failure has now become a success. So now we're using T2 small. So yeah, that's the demo of both of those features that have been quite popular these past few months. Any questions?
Yeah, and guys, the only thing I would add to that is if any of you are interested in understanding how auto remediation or template scanning or anything else could be useful to you guys, we're more than happy to help you. You could, we offer a free trial. You can start a trial on our website, but if you want to have a call with us where we share your screen and we help you configure things in the most optimal fashion, or we help you set up auto remediation so you can see how it works in your own environment, please just reach out. And yes, we open up the floor to some questions. We encourage you to ask as many of them as many challenging ones as you have.
So any questions? That's not a lot.
Maybe some questions here in the room? Is that possible?
I'll have a question for myself. So in auto remediation, so I had to click a button this time to actually get it to trigger the remediation. Is it possible to have it done automatically where there's no actual human involvement? The answer is yes, it is possible, depending on how you configure your SMS communication channel. Any other questions?
Staying.
The cloud formation linting check tool can be also embedded in CI/CD pipelines.
Yes, that's the ideal scenario. Actually, when our customers, how they use it is not via the console, is they would connect this to their Jenkins scripting, where there's a step that sends the Cloud Conformity API a copy of the CloudFormation template. Then we spit back a set of results, positive and negative. And depending on those results, it's up to you to decide what to do with them. If you're totally fine with
Still deployed.
yeah, if you're totally fine with still deploying, by all means.
We are building a Terraform version as well. So it's going to work in the exact same way for Terraform. That's going to take some time. We're aiming for that to be ready sometime this year.
Okay, maybe another question. You briefly touched on it during your talk, but how to position this related to cloud native checks and guardrails?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing that I'll stress again is we haven't built Cloud Conformity to compete with and eradicate those tools. We have strong integrations for them, and we can enhance the user experience of those. How to compare? I think it's hard to compare it to a particular cloud native tool. I think you can only really compare it to a whole suite of cloud native tools. And the reality is that there's probably very little that is not possible to do. Or there's probably very little that we do that's not possible to do using cloud native tooling. However, our experience is that the types of companies that have the skill set to be able to do that are quite few and far between. And we've got quite a few customers that were able to do that successfully, but they felt that they were going to be more efficient and save time and save money in the form of time largely, even though many of those tools come with costs to AWS as well, by rather, in some cases, removing some of those services that they were using, but using AWS native services that they felt worked cohesively with Cloud Conformity as a hybrid type of thing. So that's how I'd compare it rather than to individual native service. The one thing I think that you will just never get, other than say Trusted Advisor, where there's a small number of guardrails, is the depth and breadth of guardrails. So even if you're using config, I think config comes at quite a high cost at scale, you still have to ultimately have someone think about what these guardrails are going to be, and that's a challenge. A big part of the reason why customers of ours that are very cloud native, like Novartis and Atlassian, who were doing things in a brilliant way before moved over, was the guardrails. They were still worried about, well, what about risks that we just don't know about, and we're not keeping up pace with AWS. So yeah. Okay.
There's one question in the chat. What about pricing and distribution model?
So I think I understand the first part of the question. I'm not so sure if I understand what you mean by distribution model. So I'll answer the pricing, and then I'll probably get you to elaborate on what you mean by that. The pricing model is one of two ways. It's either on a per account per month basis. So for each account you plug into Conformity, it's either $335 per account or $225, depending on how many accounts, the band that you fall into. But the most common way we charge is a fixed price, because the per account per month model can be flawed, right? We've taken Novartis as an example. They've got about 400 accounts, of which a huge amount of them have less than $20 worth of resourcing. They still want to govern those, but it doesn't really make sense for them to pay per account. Similarly, we've got a customer in Australia that's spent close to $1 million a month in AWS, and they've got 2 accounts. We wouldn't want to charge them $600 to manage an infrastructure of that size. So we would ordinarily fix a price based on the size of the overall infrastructure. How we would come to that size, the data point we would focus on is the spend with AWS, but we would then fix the price for the duration of the agreement based on that. So you wouldn't have to worry that the price would change on a month by month basis because your AWS invoice always changes. We would fix it based on the size, and we would then it would work as a percentage of spend. So it would be typically between 2 and 5%, depending on how large that infrastructure was, and that's how we would come to it.
Okay.
There's another question.
Yeah. Well, I think the distribution model.
That was good.
Yeah, in the Q&A, I see there's a question.
Yeah, so another question, what about your estimates with respect to learning curve of the tool, and how does this compare to the actual customer adoption?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's no precise answer to this, right? Because different businesses have different complexity. Their infrastructure in AWS is, infrastructures are different. Some are more complex than others, and some companies have less talented individuals than others, right? So what we see is that, I suppose the way I'll answer this question is, firstly, the way Cloud Conformity is designed is that over time, the more you use the tool, the more the tool works for itself, right? Now, it will never completely work for itself because you have changes in your AWS infrastructure that you need to right size and align with Cloud Conformity, but it is designed so that the more you use it, the more it works for itself. But the workload is definitely weighted to the beginning, right? So the beginning is when you have the majority of the work to do. But most of that work actually gets done during an evaluation, especially with profiles, because you can configure just a few profiles and then roll it out at scale. And we would help you with that. But that really depends on each customer, right? What their infrastructure looks like and the amount of time and talent the person has that's driving it. So there's some AWS infrastructures where they're quite straightforward and you can literally set up Cloud Conformity in 2 or 3 hours at the most. But there's others where for sure, cumulatively, if you take into account the time that we spend with them, and we try to spend as much time on shared screen calls or in person, helping them configure the account in the most optimal fashion, with the time that they spend on their own, they can spend in excess of 10 hours, I would say, in the worst case. So it really does depend, but I would say in straightforward cases, 2 hours or so. In more complex scenarios, maybe 10 hours. In terms of just the general usage of the tool, I suppose there's elements of the tool that take a little bit more learning, but we feel the feedback that we get is that we have designed the tool to be quite easy to understand. I think the whole premise or large premise of the tool was making it easier for users to get to the same outcome, and therefore being able to introduce it to new teams or team members, some of which are now highly skilled. So I never really get feedback about people who are battling to use the tool.
The main
it's
way
onboarding that takes a bit of time.
The main way people find this is through the knowledge base, and because it's so easy to use with these very clear step-by-step instructions, we've tried to maintain that sort of user experience throughout the entire platform. Step-by-step, things that are self-explanatory, self-evident design.
Yeah, but I wouldn't want to paint the picture to you guys that this is a SaaS tool that you switch on and it just works from the get-go. There's some elbow grease that you would have to put into it in the beginning. How much you have to put in just depends on your own business.
Okay. There are no new questions in the queue. Maybe on data location. Which regions is it hosted?
Yeah, so currently there's 3 regions where we host data, which are Sydney, US West, and Dublin Island. We are looking at rolling out a few more because of some demands we got from public sector customers around data sovereignty.
To be clear, it's your choice in which region you want your data hosted. It's not hosted in all 3.
Yes, that's important. And it's the metadata, right? Encrypted at rest. So again, we don't have visibility of any data. We hold that data for a year. You can choose to delete it at any point. but we don't have access to any of that data. But right now it's in one of those 3 regions that you choose one of, and potentially more.
Okay, thanks. Well, if there are no new questions, then we're at the end of the webinar. Let's wait for a few questions, a few last minutes, sorry, seconds.
You do the summarizing, right?
Yeah, by recording. Okay, so I guess there are no questions anymore. We will assure everyone received the links and of the presentations and the recordings as well. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and
Thank the speakers.
and thanks to the speakers.
You're welcome. Thank you guys for having us.
And see you soon. Okay, bye.
Bye bye. Thanks. Bye.